The train rattled violently along the tracks, each metal screech a cruel reminder of what lay ahead. Crammed into the cattle cars, bodies pressed against each other. From every side, he could barely breathe. The air was thick, and the sweat, fear, and quiet sobs of people who had lost everything. He clutched his manuscripts, the work of his life, his theories on human psychology. He had spent years refining it, but none of it mattered now. The moment that the train stopped, everything would be taken from him. His home, gone. His title as a doctor, gone. Meaningless. His wife, his family, separated. As the train screeched to a stop, the doors were thrown open. Barking dogs and shouting guards, a sea of prisoners stepped into the unknown. He had no control over what would happen next. But what he did have control over was his mind. And that would be the thing that they could never take from him. Before he was a prisoner, before he was just a number in a death camp, he was a doctor, a thinker, a man of science. He had dedicated his life to understanding human suffering and how people process emotions, how they find purpose, how the mind can endure pain. But now, he was the experiment. Stripped of his identity, starved, beaten, humiliated, he watched men twice his size break under the weight of hopelessness. Strong men crumbled, and weak men survived. Why? That question burned in his mind as he trudged through the snow, his ribs visible from beneath his torn uniform, his feet blistered and raw. What made the difference? It wasn't physical strength. It was mental strength, emotional resilience, and the ability to focus on what still could be controlled. He began observing those things all around him, searching for patterns. Two prisoners would face the same starvation, the same labor, the same horror, but one gave up and the other held on. So what separated them? The one thing: hope. The ones who survived weren't necessarily the strongest. They were the ones who had a reason to live. The man who dreamed of reuniting with his family. A prisoner who imagined finishing his life's work. A father who wanted to tell his story to the world. They had something bigger than the pain that they were enduring. And he realized something profound. Suffering itself does not destroy people. Suffering without meaning does. He clung to this truth. Every morning before the guards forced him to march in the snow, he reminded himself of this. I have a choice. I can give up, or I can give meaning to the suffering. That choice was the only freedom he had left. It was the only one that mattered. Against all odds, he survived. The war ended, and the camps were liberated. But his family did not return. The wife he longed for was gone. His parents, gone. The life he had before, completely wiped away. He could have let the grief consume him, but instead, he made a radical decision. He would dedicate the rest of his life to sharing what he had learned. He wrote the book, Man's Search for Meaning, a book that would inspire millions. He pioneered logotherapy, a field of psychology focused on finding purpose in the suffering. He taught the world that no matter what happens to you, you always have the power to choose your response. The prisoner who lost everything but refused to give up. The man who discovered that even in suffering we have power. The survivor who turned his pain into a roadmap for millions. That man is Viktor Frankl. A man who proved that you can take everything from a person except their ability to choose their mindset. You have to learn to control the controllables. The trauma changes people. It shakes the foundation and steals certainty, and it makes you question everything. But what Viktor taught us is that even in the darkest moments, that you're not powerless. That you don't control what happens to you, how people treat you, the struggles you face, but you do control how you respond, the meaning you give to your pain, the mindset you choose to carry forward. Viktor had every reason to give up, but he didn't. And because he didn't, he changed the world. So what about you? What pain have you endured? But more importantly, what meaning will you give to it? Welcome to the Mental Health Janitors, where we help you clean up the mess in your head. I'm your host, Sergeant Q, and with me as always, Doc Jess.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for being here.
All right, Jess, did you know who I was speaking about before we got to the end?
No.
Really? I thought that you would have known this.
No, we studied him a little bit in grad school, but I mean, it's years ago that I even remember his name.
Oh, have you ever read the book?
No, and I always filmed his story.
That's your homework then, is to read the book. You're going to absolutely love it.
Okay.
You're going to absolutely love it.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was a Holocaust survivor. He was a doctor, psychologist when he went in. And so he looked at it as an experiment. He was in the experiment. He had done hundreds and hundreds of other experiments with other people. And now he looked at it as he was the experiment. And so that was the meaning. Like, okay, this suffering's gonna have meaning.
Yeah.
And I'm going to look at this like I would any other scientific experiment. And then he came back and gave his findings to the world. It's been a phenomenal book. And if you haven't read it yet, highly recommend it.
Yeah.
It will help you tremendously, just as it's helped me and thousands of other people.
Speaking of suffering, as you guys have, as our lovely watchers, I'm having some neck issues. So if you see me like standing funny, it's because I'm in intolerable pain.
Yeah,
suffering.
She's got a pinched nerve in her neck. She's actually going to go in and get surgery here in a couple weeks. Right?
I'm just meeting with the surgeon.
Finally
giving in to meet with him. So yeah, we'll keep you updated. So just bear with me as I have
the meaning that she's giving to her suffering is to bring this education to all of you.
Yes.
What a great allegory.
Yes, I love that. So this month of March, we're doing a special March mental health month, even though it's not until May.
Well, and here's the thing, when you're coming out of the holidays, which is usually a lot of excitement, you get into January, there's this huge consumer lull. So the economy slows down, business slows down, everybody kind of resets, and it's a hard restart. Then you have February, which is a short month, and then March, taxes are due. So this is actually a stressful time for a lot of people because they've overspent on the holidays. Things didn't end up the way that they thought they would. Now they're starting over with a new year. So it's a lot of extra stress. And then, of course, you've got to pay the government a bunch of taxes, to do flamingo testing in Saudi Arabia.
We're not going there. Okay. Yes. So thank you for being with us. This is week 2 out of 4 weeks of the month of March that we're going to be.
Thank you, Doge.
Condensing some of the things we've taught over the last almost 2 years and giving them to you in this 4-week special. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about is stuff that you've already heard before, and that's good. That's repetitive things are very important for when you watch us.
We're going back to the basics. So
yes.
These are foundational things that if you're a new viewer, maybe you don't know them. If you've been with us a long time, these are great refreshers. We go back to the basics all the time.
Right. So today we're going to talk about how trauma shapes mental health. So we want to explain to you guys how trauma plays a physical and emotional role and how it rewires our brains.
Yeah, so let's first talk about there's 2 ways that your brain can experience trauma. There's the physical side with a TBI, traumatic brain injury, where it could be a concussion, getting hit in the head, some sort of brain damage where there's physical components of the brain that aren't working properly. And then there's the other side of trauma, which is more of the emotional, visual, verbal things that you hear, see, smell, experience that maybe don't physically damage that part of the brain from a blow to the head, but it still damages the brain's neural connections, the way that those synapses fire, and they have to rewire in a different way to protect you from that trauma happening again. So 2 types of trauma, and we just want to make that distinction very clear, that you can receive a physical blow to the head, a concussion, and that causes a type of traumatic brain injury. But more common was what we see are these emotional, mental wounds of that traumatic experience and how it changes the neural connections in our brain. So for the most part of what we're talking about today, we're going to talk about that side of it. We will touch a little bit on the physical side, but for the most part, it's going to be that emotional, mental side of trauma and how that affects our brain, because it's the hardest for us to actually see and be able to work with.
Yeah. And so there's the four main types of trauma and how they impact our mental health is childhood trauma, sexual trauma, combat trauma, and then unmet needs in early development. And so if we start with childhood trauma, this is like major emotional neglect. This is some kind of physical abuse you experience as a child, a toxic home environment. This leads to anxiety, depression, people-pleasing kind of personalities, and emotional dysregulation. Sexual trauma is, betrayal, you feel betrayal, you feel deep shame, unsafe in your own body. This leads to PTSD, trust issues, and identity struggles. And then combat trauma, as Q and I have experienced, this is any kind of exposure to violence, loss of brothers or sisters in arms, either in combat or once we get home, to suicide. This leads to our hypervigilance, emotional shutdowns, and also explosive anger.
Yeah, so overreactions. Yeah, absolutely. And probably the one we see most often are those bursts of anger. Like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah. So, and then the last but not least is more of a subtle type of trauma, and this is unmet needs in our early childhood development. Between the ages of 2 to 7, some research shows 2 to 9. These are the programming years of our lives, and this is where children need to learn emotional regulation, okay? If a parent didn't teach you a healthy emotional regulation intentionally between those years, kids either suppress emotions or they become overwhelmed by them. A lot of us were raised in the generation of, kids are seen, not heard. And if you have something to complain about, I'll give you something to complain about type philosophies. And I don't want to beat a dead horse, but right, like that's one extreme. And then now we've gone to the other extreme of this gentle parenting, where we are very permissive parents. So we have to find an equal balance. And I teach a parenting, raising mentally resilient children. So catch me offline if you want some more information about that. But unmet needs in those early developmental years, it also results in emotional reactive adults, okay? People, as they grow up and they haven't learned intentionally or been taught intentionally how to, in a healthy way, regulate their emotions and process them, I would say 99% of my clients that come in for anxiety, depression, or anger management, as we unpack the layers of their life, they had a toxic home environment, or not even that drastic, just parents who just didn't know. They did the best they could with what they had. And then, if I were to interview the parents and say, I hear what you're saying, you did the best you could with what you had. What classes did you take to learn to be better? What books did you read? And if the answer is no, sorry to tell you guys, sorry, not sorry, you didn't do the best you could. Because I had incredible parents and I still read books and try to learn to be better, right? And so there's no excuses for, well, I did the best that I could. And for some of you, it's too late. And that's really sad.
It's true. I read a study on these orphanages. Here's a great example. There was these orphanages that when the Iron Curtain fell and the Soviet Union broke into all these other, Baltic states that we see, they looked at the orphanages there because it was finally opened up. And when you looked at all these different orphanages, and then they since have found it all throughout the world, it wasn't just them, but this is when they really started to notice it. When people would go in, these foreign aid workers and stuff would go into these orphanages to try and help the babies and the kids and get them adopted and all of these different things. One thing that they found was really, really spooky was that in the nurseries, none of the babies were crying. They just didn't cry. And they couldn't figure out why that was. After a psychologist came in, very quickly ascertained that they stopped crying because it didn't do anything to get the attention of adult to meet whatever need that they had. So crying for a child, the purpose is to alert an adult that they need food, they need water, they need changing, they need something. And what these children had learned, because there was no adult there to take care of them to meet those needs, that they just stopped crying because there was no necessity for it, because whether they cried or not, they didn't get their needs met. So why waste the energy doing it?
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. It's very fascinating and heartbreaking. But you guys, it's not just trauma that shapes our mental health. It's also our own thoughts that can work against us. Even when we don't realize it, usually we don't realize it. 9 out of 10 times we don't even realize that our own thoughts are working against us.
And we call this cognitive distortion, right?
Yes.
Yeah, look at that.
Way to transition us into our next segment. So
I call it getting stuck on stupid. When I wrote my
Yes.
book, I didn't know that term, cognitive distortion.
Mhm.
And so I just called it getting stuck on stupid.
yeah, so faulty thought patterns are cognitive distortions. So we're going to talk about why and how they develop, making our mental health worse, okay? So what are they? It's an automatic negative thought pattern that distorts our reality. And our brain learns these patterns in childhood, and usually based on trauma, stress, or unmet needs, right? And so if they go left unchecked, these thoughts lead to anxiety, depression, anger, and unhealthy relationships. Some of the most common cognitive, and maybe I can do some research and tag whatever. We went into great detail about cognitive distortions in one of our other episodes, but some of the most common, I'm just going to tell you 5. One of them is all or nothing thinking, and this is an example could be, if I fail once, I'm a complete failure, right? This leads to perfectionism, procrastination, and burnout, okay?
And here's a great example of that. I hear a lot of people who want to own a business get stuck in that right there. Like, oh, I want to do a business, but they feel like if they fail, that it's going to be, their whole life is going to be a failure. And so they never actually start. And I work with a lot of businesses, several hundred every single year. And I see that a lot with people who want to start a business, but they haven't actually done it yet.
Yeah.
And that's what's holding them back.
All or nothing.
Yep.
You got a little nugget that you can, what would be Sergeant Q's term for that? You know how you have stuck on stupid for cognitive distortions? What would your all or nothing thinking label be?
I don't know. All or nothing. I feel like you have an idea for me.
I don't.
Oh, all or nothing.
You have all the good ideas. I'll give you some time.
Okay.
The second really, really, really common one is called catastrophizing. And this is something like, if something bad happens, my life is over. And this leads to chronic stress and anxiety. And you'll notice that a lot of these kind of overlap.
Yeah, it's like snowballing, right?
Yeah, a lot of them overlap and are very common because they're all just distorted thinking patterns.
Your brain wants to go to the worst possible outcome in catastrophizing. If I fail this test, then I'm never going to get into college. I'm not going to get a good job, and I'm going to be, miserable and poor my whole life. Like, that's the worst case scenario, and your brain automatically goes to that. That's what that catastrophizing does.
Yeah. So if something bad happens, my life is over, right? And so it's kind of like catastrophizing is a really big one for combat veterans. So I remember the first time I realized I was catastrophizing was we went to a hotel as a family. I think we were on a road trip or something. And I heard sirens go by. And my mind started going like, oh my gosh, there's a criminal and he's breaking into the hotel and he's going to break into my hotel room and he's going to hold me and my whole family hostage. And right, we all know that a situation happens that leads to a thought, and that thought leads to an emotion or a feeling, and then that emotion or feeling leads to a behavior. So, and in that process, we have a physiological reaction in our bodies, like it's actually happening. So my body is actually reacting as if there's an intruder coming into my hotel room to hold my family hostage. How good is that for my body to experience that level of stress, right? And so I was like, oh my gosh, this is what the counselor's talking about. This is catastrophizing. And so we're going to talk a little bit later about how to find emotional balance and how do we start. And it's with awareness. Thank you, G.I. Joe. Knowing is half the battle. And just starting to recognize what my cognitive distortions were and where they would take place. That's just the first step. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. So the third one is also emotional reasoning. And this is, I feel worthless, so I must be worthless. This leads to low low self-esteem and self-sabotage. Number 4, personalization and blame. It's all my fault versus it's all their fault, right? So you either take all the blame for something or you blame somebody else for all the fault, okay? And then last is filtering, only focusing on the negative and ignoring the positive. We also call that
the negative bias.
Yes, which he also didn't know.
No,
as he was writing his book.
No, I didn't know these terms. I was a layman trying to figure this stuff out.
Mm-hmm. So this also leads to chronic dissatisfaction and hopelessness. And as we heard from our story, hopelessness is not a good place to be, right? So the good news is, just like our minds learn these distorted ways of thinking, they can actually learn healthier ways. You have to remember that for however many years old you are, so I'm 41, and if these cognitive distortions take root between 2 and 7, I don't know, I'm bad at math. What's 41 minus 6? 35?
35.
Yeah, look at me. So I have 35 years of... I'm going to be a doctor soon. And they're going to have to call me doctor and answer these stupid questions. So I have 36 years of a learned pattern of one of these cognitive distortions. Have grace for yourself, because it doesn't happen overnight. You have to unlearn those bad habits and relearn the new ones. And so we're going to go into now how to find emotional balance, and that healing starts with an awareness.
So Jess, let's talk about, okay, now we know what the problem is. We understand the brain and how these things can happen with trauma. We know the bad side. So what's the upside? How do we fix this?
Yeah, so it's called emotional regulation. And what emotional regulation is it's just the ability to feel emotions, but not be ruled by them, or not stuffing them down, which some of us do as well. One way that I teach my clients how to start with this is the emotional thermometer. And so there's also a podcast that we go into great detail about the emotional thermometer, right. But it's really fun. So when we first learned this, we go to the dollar store and we get the big poster boards and we draw a thermometer, and the girls each get one, and we put one in the kitchen, and we put one in their rooms, and they color in the thermometer. So the bottom is green, blue, and then it goes to yellow, and then it goes to orange, and then it goes to red. And 10 to 1, right? 1 is like, I'm super chill. I'm as chill as it gets. 10 is like complete panic mode. I'm 100% in my parasympathetic.
Parasympathetic, yeah.
Yeah, I get those two mixed up, and I can't even function. And so a lot of people only register when they're at a 1 or at a 10, and they don't realize that they go in between. And so the first step is keeping a log or a journal of checking in with yourself morning, afternoon, and evening for like 2 weeks. Just commit to 2 weeks of either on your phone keeping a note, or in a journal keeping a note, and then maybe after the number writing a little bit about why. And then you can start to see patterns. Maybe there's a certain part of the day that you get elevated because something happens.
Or a certain day of the week.
And so, right? And so just being aware of when our emotions get elevated, right? And so how to start fixing emotional irregulation? Go ahead. Just kidding.
I blacked out.
Sorry, I blacked out. First, we want to identify our triggers. We can't run from them. Yes. We have to identify what triggers us.
And here's the thing I'll say about triggers. That other people trigger you, that's not their fault. It's your responsibility to make people aware of the triggers. But it's still, if they hit those, it's still not their fault. It's 100% your responsibility to manage your triggers. It's not the world's responsibility. It's not your friends, your family. It's not their responsibility. Can they help you? Sure. But it is 100% your responsibility to manage your triggers, knowing the things that cause you to spark those trauma memories and avoiding them until you can learn to manage that process. That's 100% your responsibility. The world does not owe you anything, and they do not need to tiptoe around you. And until you change your mindset around that the world owes you nothing and it's 100% your responsibility to fix it, you're never going to be able to heal properly, because it's so much easier to just blame other people for your bad behavior.
Yeah, and ask me how I know. I sat in my pity party for years.
Yeah, me too.
Blaming the army.
Yeah, my pity party was in my car, homeless, on the streets of Auburn. That's what it was.
I sat in my little sob fest, and I blamed the army, and I blamed the political reasons we went to, whatever. I blamed everything else. And yeah, it wasn't until I experienced my first weekend, Memorial Day weekend, that I wasn't blackout drunk on Operation Restore Hope with this guy, and where I realized, like, okay, I can do this. This is better. And started taking ownership.
Yeah, that's a big piece when you realize that you're at least 50% of every single problem. That was a big game changer for me. And that the other thing I learned when I was there, the first time I went through that, years before I started leading teams, that despite my disabilities, despite all these things that were burdening me, I could still make a difference in the world. That was revolutionary for me, because I just thought I was washed up, worthless, couldn't do anything anymore. But when I went on that trip and I was able to help somebody else, I realized, like, oh, I can make a difference. I just got to keep this together. And I really started to double down on investigating the brain and figuring out what is happening.
Yeah. Okay. So step 1, awareness, find out your triggers. What emotions are you avoiding? And then, do you overreact to those emotions, or do you shut down? Number 2, name your cognitive distortions. You go on ChatGPT or Google it. What are the most common cognitive distortions? And give me examples, and go through them yourselves. Take some ownership, or go back and look at our podcast about cognitive distortions.
But here's the warning. Okay, that label may describe what you're experiencing, but it does not describe who you are. There's a huge difference.
Yes.
It describes what you're experiencing, not who you are. So do not take that label as the identity. And I see this all the time with the victim mentality. And I see it a lot now, especially when it comes to, because America is such a melting pot, when it comes to race or social economical status or gender identity, that becomes who you are 100% instead of something you experienced. You take that label on as who you are, which what it does is it prevents you from ever taking responsibility for anything that happens. And it allows you to put that blame onto everybody else as them being the problem. And if that is where you're going to take these labels, you're doing yourself a huge disservice. We're sharing this with you, not to self-diagnose to where you say, this is who I am now. It's more to say, this is what I'm experiencing, and there's a pathway through it.
Yes.
So I want to make that very clear.
Yes. And unfortunately, the mental health trend, right, where like everybody's like, we're advocates for mental health, and we say talk about it. We don't say let it rule your life and become an identity for you. Talk about it so you know it's there, so you can learn how to work through it and become better. So nice little rabbit hole there.
Yeah, sorry.
Good job, Battle.
I was like, wait, let's make this very clear that we're not telling you to self-diagnose and then that becomes your identity. But this is what I'm experiencing, and how do I get through it?
Yeah. Okay, so number 2, we're going to name our cognitive distortion. Okay, we're going to name it. We're going to say, I'm experiencing some distorted thoughts related to catastrophizing. You're going to ask yourself, what's the story my brain is telling me, and is it really true?
Yeah.
Okay. Step 3 is small changes that build emotional strength. Journaling thoughts before reacting. Practice deep breathing when your emotions rise, or talking to a trusted friend or a counselor. And really quick, you guys, next week, I'm going to go into great detail about this, a tool you can use specifically to help with some of your cognitive distortions. So make sure you stay tuned for next week. So today, let's recap what we talked about.
Yeah, so I want to touch back on the physical versus the emotional side of trauma. And sometimes you experience both. In combat, you experience both. It could be a car accident, you experience both. So sometimes these happen together where you have a physical damaging of the brain and then you have a mental damaging of the brain, which still really is physical because it disrupts the way the neural connections fire and the chemical regulation in the brain. So they're both actually physical, but one is from a physical blow and the other one is from witnessing or experiencing something traumatic. So when I do this research, I find all of these rabbit holes to go down, she calls them. I call them wormholes because the things that I'm discovering and that I'm researching and I'm finding, we don't really have a good explanation. So if you don't know what a wormhole is, it's a, should I go into this? Oh, I'm going into this. All right.
No.
So a wormhole is a science fiction term about how you can travel great distances over time and space by bending the time-space continuum. So in an instant, you can go galaxies. That's the theory behind wormholes. Okay, now that we understand that, there's all of these things about the brain that we just don't understand yet. And it is fascinating when you look at how the brain operates. We know very little about it. We're just now starting to discover it. But here's one of the things that I found in my research that I thought was amazing. So there was a man named Jason Paget, and he's from actually Tacoma, Washington, just a few minutes south of here. What we're going to talk about is how he went from a barroom brawler to an incredible mathematician in an instant. So this guy was a barroom brawler. He was a salesman at a furniture shop, and he wasn't anybody who was interested in math or art or any of these things. Well, one night, coming out of a bar, he gets into a fight. Some guys tried to rob him, and he takes a serious blow to his head. And this blow, it caused a TBI, which is a traumatic brain injury. So a physical blow damaged part of the physical brain inside of his skull. Well, what happened is that it affected his left hemisphere. And what that did is it opened up the subconscious mind on the right hemisphere. And he started to see the world in these incredible patterns, these patterns that were overlaying everything. We call these patterns fractals. And what fractals are advanced mathematic computations. And he started to see these things everywhere in everything that he looked at. And so he started drawing them out. And other mathematicians found like, hey, these are fractals. How do you know this? How do you understand this highly advanced mathematical equation? He didn't really know. He just automatically had this information and he started utilizing it. He became one of the best mathematicians of our time. And he acquired this. It's called the acquired savant syndrome is what he was diagnosed with, because he took a blow to the head and he immediately started seeing these advanced mathematical computations. It's not something that he learned. This is stuff that was already in his brain that was just unlocked because of this. So just think about that. Every single thing that you need to know in your life is already inside of here. You just have to unlock it. So when we go to school and we learn, we're not really learning. We're just unlocking the knowledge that's already inside of us. We're just becoming aware of it. So as you go through this process with us, as you start to learn these things, everything we're teaching you, you already intrinsically know.
I like
this
that.
proves it.
Yeah.
All we're doing is opening your mind to the idea that it's there.
Yeah.
I thought that was fascinating. So I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
That's cool.
That this proves that everything we need to know, all the way to advanced mathematical calculations, drawing fractals. And just Google fractal and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about.
No thanks.
It's incredible.
I believe you.
But it's already there. We just have to unlock that capability inside our brain. And it doesn't take a whack on the head to do it. You can do it every day with the mental health janitors. Because what are we trying to do here, Jess?
We're here to educate, empower, and encourage you on your mental health journey.
So for the mental health janitors, I'm Sergeant Q.
I'm Doc Jess.
And we're out.